And so we said we are going to be having a conversation on education and the various issues around it, especially being exam time, and also in light of the fact that in December, the National Leadership Forum shall be focusing on education. And so we shall be having this conversation not only here. We've had some of the views from the county of Murang'a. We'll pick some from the county of Uasin Gishu, as well as the county of Mombasa, and many other counties as much as we're able to get them. And now we're joined in studio by Alex Cole, the Director of Strategic Communications at IREX International. Thank you for joining us. And we have Melizsa Mugyenyi, the country representative of Kenya and Tanzania at the same organization. And just get straight into it. Melizsa, I'll begin with you. We are seeing we're in the exam season. And one of the most unfortunate things that we're seeing, as much as you know, there's a lot of effort by the government to ensure that the credibility of the examinations is upheld. We're seeing young girls who are doing their KCPE or KCSE and they're either pregnant or mothers. What needs to be done, within the education circles to ensure that we safeguard these girls from, the predators who, that is basically, well, there's nothing like consent in that case, which is what even the PS said. What needs to be done to safeguard them?
I think that's a very important question, and the answer is a complex one. When you unpack the reasons driving the teenage pregnancy crisis, it's a mix of various factors. Lack of safe spaces at schools, at communities, deeply entrenched cultural practices and perceptions around the role of women and girls and their contributions to communities, as well as poverty, which is, of course, as you know, in Kenya and many parts of the world, a major driving factor. So when you look at the efforts of the Ministry of Education, looking at an audit to better understand the crisis, these types of efforts should definitely be supported by other ministries and local authorities because the issue is cross-cutting. From a community point of view, ensuring that dialogue at the community level strengthens these efforts and that community members are engaged on finding solutions and really understanding the driving factors behind the teenage pregnancy crisis is critical.
And I mean, when you talk about community, that's an interesting part because usually we have a finger-pointing kind of thing at government. Government should do A, B, C, D. Maybe if you could quickly expound before I cross over to Alex on what needs to be done by us. We are not the government as individuals, and we're just members of the community where we are finding our girls being abused.
Now, learning of students happens not just in school, but in communities. In fact, the majority of learning happens in communities. So the onus is on all members of communities, from parents to community elders and leaders and so forth. From dialogue to community-driven initiatives to really empowering communities to strengthen linkages between their voice and local authorities. The role for communities to really shift some of these trends is crucial.
Alex, and as IREX, you're in over 100 countries. Do you see these kind of situations in many other countries? Like when you look at the cases of, students and pupils who are having to sit their national examinations under such circumstances, is it something that you feel Kenya is in a very serious crisis kind of situation comparative to other countries?
I think this is something that is a problem all around the world. And actually, we have a program right next door in Tanzania. It's interesting. It was actually a program focused on civil society engagement, so actually talking outside of the classroom for a minute. I think there's a role to be played there, but just to focus on the civil society side, we ran a program that was called Data Zetu, where the goal was to surface issues that local communities think are a problem on their block. And this was actually one of the #1 things, teen pregnancy, that kept coming up again and again. But these were local conversations where we worked with leaders to find local solutions. So in one community, for instance, in Tanzania, we worked with them to identify the area of town where pregnancy is really high, where this is a really big problem. It's not just this one block. So then the community came up with this very cool creative solution to actually have a public education mural about healthcare services, everything that somebody might need that was available to them, to connect them with the public services that are available that could help them avoid having an unintended pregnancy.
Okay, and because you handle Kenya and Tanzania primarily, what's the difference when you compare the two? Are we as I mean, rather, is Tanzania at the same place we are, or are they worse, or is it less? Do we have less of those cases?
I think that's a difficult question to ask. I think what's interesting is the government's approach to tackling this issue.
Yes, yes, yes.
And when you look at the policies that are addressing gender issues, education issues, the critical thing for both governments, and indeed all governments, is to ensure engagement with the stakeholders. So how far are the views and the voices of young women and girls trickling upwards to policy? How far have civil society actors that are the front line of some of these issues been consulted when it comes to policy decision-making and government commitments and actual resource allocation around needs and so forth? But certainly back to what Alex said, communities really are critical to resolving a lot of our challenges. And that communication linkage between government and communities is critical. So as development actors, and you'll learn a little bit more about IREX as the conversation continues, our role is how do we strengthen that linkage? How do we create spaces where dialogue can happen so that whatever policies the government of Tanzania and Kenya are putting in place to address this real issue, and of course prevalence varies across counties, across districts and so forth, whatever solutions are community driven and are contextually relevant.
Okay, and you know, IREX says that you do not focus on vaccines, roads or rails, you say you focus on people. What does this exactly mean? Doesn't everyone else focus on people?
Well, I think particularly when it comes to development, there's often the immediate focus often goes to we need to build a road here, we need to build a school here, just to play out the example of education. But if you don't invest in the people behind those institutions, it's going to be a wasted investment. So we focus less on building schools and more on building the people who make schools run. We have a particular focus on investing in teachers, and that's a very intentional strategy. When you work over the course of their career, a teacher will touch thousands of students. So if early in a teacher's career you can intervene, really equip them to be the most successful educator, that will trickle down to the students. We actually, tonight, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary here as an organization. We're celebrating here in Kenya, and we're going to be honoring one of our teachers who participated in one of our programs. Her name is Alice Sayo, and she started a school in one of the counties in Kenya that's specifically for Maasai girls. And in participating in our program, that equipped her to help open that school, but also her as a teacher to practice the most and latest cutting-edge teaching techniques to make sure that the girls who went to that school were going to have the best experience, that they would be the most likely to complete their education.
Okay, and it's interesting because you find a number of people may feel that we need to build the structures, which are important. So is it that you say this is the space you're taking deliberately, or is it that because we're not trying to say that the structures don't matter?
Absolutely, the structures do matter. IREX's focus on people. We are very, very assertive about that. And it's because over the years we've seen the transformative change that individuals can have across different levels of society and sectors. In Kenya, and indeed Africa, we're perhaps best known for implementing the US government Mandela Washington Fellowship Program, which is the flagship program of YALI, the Young Africa Leadership Initiative. And so far, when you look at the network of alumni, over 3,500, it's incredible what these individual young Africans are achieving as change makers. They've gone on to spur economic growth in their countries, push for democratic governance reform, work on issues of peace and security. That power is immense. Back to what my colleague Alex mentioned, the average teacher will reach about 6,000 students over their career. That's incredible. Being able to equip that teacher with the techniques, the methodologies, the means of interacting and engaging with their students can be catalytic when we remember that teachers are our role models, often our first role models. So the focus on individuals as change makers, we've seen has great impact. But the partnership approach is critical because they are those organizations that build roads and focus on the infrastructure piece.
It's a symbiotic relationship.
Absolutely. The collective efforts essentially are what will push our communities around the world forward.
Okay, and one of the things that comes to play when we talk about developing people and the students, the pupils, is the curricula. You know, and Kenya is in the process of implementing a new curriculum. What needs to be done to ensure that it's actually successful? It's a huge change from what we've had. The 844 we've had has been very, to some extent, I must confess, as being one of the products, examination driven. That, you know, we read, we cram for the exam. If you get the same exam, 3 days later you may not get the same score. Unfortunately, but this one is a bit more practical. So it has a lot of promise when it's on paper. What needs to be done to ensure that it's actually successful?
Well, I can let Melizsa comment about the Kenyan context specifically, but maybe just one of the things we've found
in principle.
More broadly, yeah, because we've worked on education in many countries around the world. When a new curriculum is rolled out, as you were inferring, it's often test-driven and it's often book-driven. The thing that often gets missed is igniting student interest and passion in a subject. So one of the things we have tried to do to make a country successful in implementing a new curriculum is to make sure that students are actually interested in pursuing it. So just take STEM education, for instance. One of the biggest problems why many people don't pursue STEM careers, in high school, they lose interest in STEM and math and science, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But we have implemented project-based learning practices. So that's when you have a student or a group of students pick some challenge in their community, they figure out a STEM solution to that, and then actually build a prototype. They're using all of those principles of the curriculum, right, that are informing how they're building a prototype, their solution, but they're actually doing something that they can touch that's going to have some meaning to their community. And we find when you use those approaches, students are more likely to engage in the curriculum and they're more likely to pursue STEM careers. This is actually a program we called World Smarts. That's a virtual exchange between classrooms that helps facilitate both cross-country and cross-cultural learning, because that's an essential 21st century skill, but it ensures that a curriculum is going to succeed because students are going to be interested in pursuing it.
Okay.
To add on the Kenyan context, I think the move to a competency-based curriculum is a smart move. And I think the hope is that other countries on the continent will make that move. Speaking to the 21st century skills that my colleague has mentioned, this competency-based curriculum should equip our students with the skills that they need to excel in today's world. Problem solving, critical thinking, and so forth. It should really tap into their abilities and their aptitude as individuals. And we know that the world of work is changing. We know that for the 12 million students or graduates that are coming out of our universities and so forth, there are only 3 million jobs, traditional jobs, that are available on the continent each year. So looking at how students and youth can have transferable skills that focus on their aptitude, focus on their social, emotional skill set is critical. As IREX, we're going to be looking more so in East Africa at that piece, career progression and skill sets. And for us, some of the key trends that we're seeing around equipping the youth to thrive in today's very, very different and changing dynamic workplace is digital literacy, essential skills, leadership skills, and stronger linkages to private sector. So that's what you can expect from us in the years to come.
All right, and one of the challenges that has been present in Africa, especially in terms of education and quality education at that, is the access, and access is partly a factor of cost. You find that, you know, for me to go to a certain school of a certain caliber, I may not be able to afford it if I don't earn a certain amount of money, for instance. So in principle, again, for you, Alex, where should the balance be in regards to giving quality and at still an affordable cost?
I mean, the answer is you really need both, right? I mean, part of this is countries, donor countries, really have to make a commitment to education and to invest in it. It's just fundamentally not cheap. You get what you pay for. I mean, before when we were talking about infrastructure versus people, both of these things are expensive, but you absolutely need to outlay the dollars to have quality schools, to make sure that, you know, somebody doesn't have to walk 2 hours to get to school, right? You know, when I was talking to some of our teachers here in Kenya, this was one of the things they kept bringing up again and again, was it's impossible to educate somebody if they are, you know, 1,000 miles from a school, or 100 miles from a school, or 50 miles from a school, and that just costs money. There are ways that I think that you can engage local communities more to try to find creative solutions. Is there some space in a community that's not really used, and we could use that as an educational enrichment program, right? So I think there's more we could do there to try to find some more cost-effective methods, but there just isn't, we just can't get away with having quality education without seriously investing in it.
Okay, and for Kenya, for instance, we've got free primary school education, secondary school. There's a risk of having, and we've seen it already, the teacher to student or pupil ratio is a bit of a concern, because you find there's 60 pupils in one class and there's one teacher assigned to them. Now, again, does this pose the challenge of potentially having poor quality of education for the masses, especially because they're the masses that one day will be the mass that will get into the job market? Does it mean that we're likely to, if nothing is done, we're going to get, you know, a workforce that is not as strong as it should be?
And that's a risk, and it's a risk I think that, that the government, I'm sure, grapples with. Limited resources and multiple needs and a growing population, which will only grow more. Looking at the continuum of nursery to primary, secondary education, the needs are diverse, but I think there are opportunities to work through partnerships. So I don't believe that the question is simply that the public sector should provide for all of the educational needs of Kenya's youth and children, but there's a hybrid approach that exists, private, public, and then as we mentioned, with this very dynamic, changing workforce, the need for vocational training, the need for digital literacy. So when we look at the education of our children and the youth, I think we should think a little bit beyond the traditional trajectory and look at actors crowding in to create a critical mass and to really give the options and the opportunities for youth to excel whatever fields they might go into. And that might mean higher education and tertiary education. It might not. But we should provide various avenues and pathways to education. And there are enough actors to do that.
And you know, when you talk about tertiary education, and one of the things that has been evident in Kenya is that there's a lot of growth of either the private universities, one, and two, having a lot of public universities offering the parallel courses, which are also more expensive than what would be when I finish my KCSE, whatever I'm called from, I'm called to a certain university, I'll pay significantly less than what I would pay if I'm doing parallel. So there's been a conversation about and a concern that it's becoming commercialized, that there's a preference to get people on parallel because it brings more money. One, in your own estimation, do you feel that this is a trend that's there? And what needs to be done to avoid, again, having our tertiary institutions become money-making centers as opposed to human development platforms?
That's an interesting question. I think that that education institutions fundamentally should exist to advance their students' prospects at any level. The policy environment, the regulatory environment should ensure that, and access to affordable education at all levels is something that, that I do believe the government should look at, and I'm sure is. There are opportunities for students to boost their competitiveness, and that's where players like IREX and other local providers that are looking at providing courses and other opportunities, fellowship programs, to really distill the masses and identify those change makers and give them the platform to really thrive, come into the picture. So I think there is the environment in which these universities exist that must be regulated, and in my personal opinion, the ethical focus around ultimately we're working towards the development of our nation, of our countries. And then there are also, you know, the self-starters. As students, we should be looking for opportunities to make ourselves more competitive, and we should be providing those opportunities as service providers.
And on this point about for-profit higher education, this is an issue that we've seen all around the world. And I do think that this is a place where there can be a role for government to play. There's nothing wrong with a for-profit institution as long as kids are getting a quality education. And there are government regulations and incentives that you can ask schools to. This is one of the approaches that we've taken in the United States, for instance, making sure that for-profit institutions have good outcomes. That if you're a for-profit institution, more than X number of people have to actually finish graduating. Right, so you don't have to tell that business how to operate, but you can say you've got to meet this very minimum standard, and if not, we might revoke your credentials. So that's one thing that you can do that's very cost effective, right? That's not a policy that costs the government anything, and you can still do it within a for-profit context where it's not necessarily hurting the bottom line of that institution as long as they are achieving good outcomes.
Okay, and I think just back to you for a bit. She mentioned about like fellowships, and we have times when you have, say, students from Kenya go to the States or to other countries for fellowships. Sometimes the question is, do the countries offering fellowships feel like there's anything they can learn from, you know, the rest of us? Because it may look like it's a one-way, come, let's teach you, as opposed to let's learn from each other.
So actually, as Melissa mentioned, we run the Young African Leaders Program, or one piece of it, the Mandela Washington Fellowship, and we find that the host institutions in the United States, universities from, you know, famous universities, Howard universities to Ivy League schools, they are incredibly eager to host foreign students. Because we have a competitive process, and we have to turn schools down each year. That's how high the demand is. And it's because good universities recognize that cross-cultural competency is an essential 21st century skill. Just take IBM, for instance, which is an American company. 50% of their workforce is outside of the United States. So if you're an American employee and you've never interacted with somebody from another country, you're just simply not going to be as productive as an employee, right? And educational systems, employers recognize that. So hosting a group of fellows, many of the schools that do that, they very intentionally create programming where their own students get an opportunity to interact with the fellows, to learn from them, to learn about, you know, what is culture, how is culture different in Kenya, and how, as a future business leader, do I need to interact with somebody from Kenya in order to be successful.
But first, I will still have my guest in studio. That's Alex Cole, the Director of Strategic Communications at IREX International, and Melizsa Mugyenyi, the country representative, Kenya and Tanzania at IREX as well. IREX. Maybe tell us, who is IREX, and why is IREX so concerned about setting up in Kenya and in the East African region?
Yeah, so we're a global development and education organization. We operate in 120 countries around the world, and there's really 4 things that we focus on: empowering youth, training youth, developing media, independent media around the world. We focus on developing civil society, making sure that the things that underpin successful governance are there, and then finally, we focus on education. And why we have decided to expand our presence in Kenya and East Africa generally, we're actually having, I referred to before, one of our 50th celebrations here in Nairobi tonight, and this was one of our 120 countries, this was one of the ones we picked. And it's because as we look at the promise of Kenya and East Africa, it's one of the fastest growing regions in the world. So much good work is happening here, and we found that what we have to offer really matches with the needs. And we're a nonprofit, we're a mission-driven organization. The question for us is never about generating revenue, it's about having impact and improving people's lives and making countries successful, and we really thought this was a place where we could do that. For example, talking about education, East Africa has one of the most acute teacher shortages in the world. That it's projected 20 years from now, the shortage will be, unless tens of thousands of additional teachers are trained up in classrooms, there will be a serious educational crisis. One of our greatest strengths as an organization is education development, teacher training. So that is something that we are particularly interested in, finding those sorts of opportunities to engage in education to help teachers throughout Kenya, throughout East Africa.
And do you yourselves carry out any kind of surveys? Like you said, for instance, that you have a serious crisis in the waiting, we put it that way, in regards to teachers in East Africa. Is this data that you collect yourselves, or do you get it from other sources?
That particular statistic comes from the UN. There was a quite extensive study about around the world what are the greatest education needs. And in East Africa, one of the most urgent ones was a teacher shortage, particularly in secondary education, and that's one of our greatest strengths. We do conduct original research, but there are so many organizations from the UN to the World Bank that we often use those to try to figure out where to diagnose different regions that are facing different issues and then plow in ourselves.
Okay. And why Nairobi? Why have you guys chosen to come and do it in Nairobi? Of the 120 countries rather that you're in, why Nairobi for this celebration? 50 is a big deal for many people, organizations and individuals.
Do you want to take that?
Absolutely.
Please do.
I think for us this is more than an event. The 50th anniversary is a great opportunity to take stock of what IREX, in collaboration with valued partners, has been able to achieve over the years across not just the youth space, the education space, but we do work on journalism and safety issues there across the region. So there's a lot to celebrate, and there are a lot of change makers that we work with and for to celebrate as well. So any excuse for a party is a good one.
Typical African.
But East Africa specifically, beyond the needs, East Africa across the continent, and there's some bias because I'm from the region, the replication possibilities and potential is immense. East Africans are dynamic. If we look at Kenya and the ecosystem here, whatever sector you're working in, whatever development issues you're trying to tackle, there will always be a great idea that you can capture from relevant stakeholders. There will always be a pool of partners, and that increases the risks of success and replicability. Because whatever works here can work in other contexts, not just on the continent, but beyond. So our commitment to this region and to deepening our efforts is a long-term one.
Okay, and just to possibly reiterate and just to clarify, do you do any kind of advocacy and lobbying with governments to ensure that you can have some of the things that you believe should be the situation? You might find, for instance, you feel a certain quality or caliber of work done in a certain space in education. Do you engage governments in any way, and if so, how?
So we definitely engage governments. We want to make sure that our work is complementary to the government's goals. Working at cross purposes is not helpful to anyone. So we very much view governments as partners. We are largely not a policy advocacy organization, but when we see particular opportunities, especially where we think that might have the potential to scale something, to bring it to even more people, then we often will engage in policy. I'll give you an example. We've done a lot of work on libraries and library development and using them as hubs for community engagement around whatever issue it may be, from education to any other kind of training that some community may need. Libraries are sort of ubiquitous around the world and in many countries. So we have, in some of the places where we've worked directly with libraries, we have helped the government to pass laws that will then invest more in libraries, build more libraries, improve the quality of those libraries, so that that work that we might only be able to do in certain regions gets rolled out across the entire country.
Okay, anything to add on that?
Yes. When it comes to the issue that Alex just discussed, we are absolutely focused on the people, bringing it back to the people. So while we might not be at the forefront of policy issues directly, the change makers that we're working with are lobbying and are pushing for issues within their communities around inclusivity, around social justice, around prosperity, and we're providing the networks, we're providing the knowledge, we're providing the skills to uplift them and to allow them to keep doing the work that they're doing in a conducive space. And we're very proud of our change makers and the communities that we serve.
All right, thank you very much. And I think it's just a discussion that cannot really end here. Education can take chapters, with all pun intended, chapters upon chapters of conversations. Thank you very much, Alex Cole and Melizsa Mugyenyi, who are all from IREX. And for your conversation, I just remind you that, we have the Nation Leadership Forum, which will be happening in December. And this time it will be talking about education. We're hoping to see you guys there, definitely.